Okay, great. When I was growing up in Long Beach, California, I had a pretty normal suburban life. But I also had one not-so-normal hobby. I climbed mountains. From the ages of 12 to 18, I climbed the 7 summits with my dad, the highest mountain on each continent. So today I'm going to take you around the world and through my teenage years and share the 7 most important lessons that I learned in the mountains. When I was a kid, I was always described as quiet. But that drove me pretty crazy because I felt like when I was in my element, I could live really loudly. I found my voice through climbing one night around the family dinner table when my dad announced that he wanted to climb Kilimanjaro, the highest mountain in Africa. Now keep in mind I was 12 at the time. I'd gone on hiking trips with my dad before, but if I knew anything about Kilimanjaro or even what it meant to climb a mountain, it was only in the vaguest possible sense. But something about the craziness of it made me tingle. It was a chance to be loud and in my own way. So I announced that I would go with him. It was a wild trip, and I loved it. Not only was I kind of psyched to get out of a couple of weeks of school, although I did have to bring homework along with me. It was a great chance to mix living loudly through adventure, seeing an incredible part of the world, and tucking my head down to step by step quietly get it done. So the first lesson that the 7 summits taught me is that while you can't always control how others perceive you, you can choose to do what makes you feel best in terms of how you perceive yourself. I liked the trip so much that when my dad proposed climbing Aconcagua, the highest mountain in South America, the next year, I volunteered myself as his climbing buddy again. Now I was a 13-year-old trying to figure out my place in the world, and I think a 3-week trip sounded like a pretty good way to get out of the joys of 8th grade. It's what middle schooler hasn't dreamt up a big escape. But as you're also probably aware, this isn't exactly the easiest of times in terms of having a good relationship with your parents. So props to my dad for even considering spending that much time on a mountain with me. Overall, the trip went really smoothly. That is, until we got to high camp at 19,000 feet. Now, the air is so thin at that altitude that it's not really fun. It makes your head hurt. It makes you nauseous. It makes it so even the simplest of activities can get you totally winded. Normally, when you're on a summit push, you try to go up and back down the mountain as quickly as you can. But while we were at high camp, a storm rolled in. It wasn't safe to go up, but we also weren't ready to give up and go back down. So we waited it out in the tent for 3 days. This is a glamour shot of me waiting it out in the tent. Because as I said, father, early teen-daughter relationships are hardly ever easy. Throw being stuck in a tent together for that long, and it doesn't get any prettier. I can't even really remember what the argument was about, something along the lines of where pages from the book we had torn in half to share had gone. But at the height of it getting snappy, I suddenly stopped, I looked at my dad, and I said, "You know what? This would be a lot easier if we were nice to each other." The weather did clear, and the next day we were able to go to the summit. And this taught me the second lesson of the 7 summits, which is that climbing isn't all about reveling in your own personal experience. It's also about the experience of those that you're with. By the time I was 14, my dad and I started fantasizing about climbing all of the 7 summits together. So the next year, we went to Russia to climb Europe's highest mountain, Mount Elbrus. We left for the summit hours before the sun would come out. Trudging uphill, I felt anxious, sleep-deprived, and so cold I thought my hands were going to fall off. We eventually stopped to readjust our layers, and my dad asked me how I was doing. I told him my hands were cold, but I think he could tell I was having a pretty rough time all around. He handed me a warmer pair of gloves and a mini disc player, because yes, this was before everyone had an iPod, let alone an iPhone. I slipped the gloves on, put in the earbuds, and we continued on our way. Suddenly, I noticed how unbelievably bright the stars were and how alive the wind made me feel. By the time the sun came up over the horizon, I felt like the luckiest person on earth. This is us on the summit. I'm the one in the ninja suit on the right. Because while it didn't get any warmer that day, it taught me the third lesson of the 7 summits, which is that sometimes it takes just a really easy fix, or even a change of thought, to turn misery into elation. We're now on a roll, a mountain a year. The summer I was 15, my dad and I went to Alaska to climb Denali. Denali meant a 3-week journey over snow and ice, during which we'd have to carry everything that we needed on our backs or on sleds that we'd pull along behind us as we walked, all roped together in case one of our teammates fell into a snow-covered crevasse, which are these giant chasms that happen on glaciers. During the whole trip, there were some pretty epic moments. And there were also some pretty trying ones. Like, this is me trying to cram my lunch down on a particularly blustery day. But the hardest part of the trip for me to cope with came at the very end, after our triumphant summit, when we were on our way back down. From the summit, we went to Advanced Base Camp at 14,000 feet. I felt really happy and at ease with what I had just done, but we still had a ways to go to get all the way down the mountain. While we were there, we heard about an accident that had happened a little ways down. Rocks, some as big as cars, had dislodged from a face while a team was crossing. Some members of that team were hit and badly injured, and one man died. I think death in the mountains is something that often gets sensationalized, and some people assume that confronting it is part of the appeal. But this was really the first time that it felt real to me. But by thinking through what happened to the other team, my team decided to cross that part of the route during the coldest part of the night, when the rocks would be most solidly frozen into place. And so this taught me the 4th lesson of the 7 summits, which is that sometimes even the things that we love the most can have a dark side to them. But by confronting that side, rather than shying away from it, you can at least be more thoughtful in terms of how you choose to indulge in the game. The summer I was 16, my whole family went on vacation to Australia, and my dad, my brother, and I climbed its highest mountain, Kosciuszko. Now, Kosciuszko has a bit of a reputation for being a joke to be included on the 7 summits, because it's a 7,000-foot hike that's doable in just a few hours. But we did it in the middle of Australia's winter, and as we were going up, a storm rolled in. We couldn't see anything, and so we got totally lost. And we did eventually get our bearings straight and found our way to the summit. But it taught me the 5th lesson of the 7 summits, which is to remember to maintain a healthy sense of respect for any peak, even when you've succeeded on bigger ones in the past. Next up on the list was Mount Vinson Massif, the highest point in Antarctica. By now, I was a 17-year-old high school senior, in the midst of thinking about college applications, prom, and the life ahead of me. For those of you who are there now, I'm sure you know how stressful this all is. In some ways, I felt like I was already being pushed to my limits, just trying to keep up with school and wrap my head around the fact that in just a few months, my whole life as I knew it was about to pretty radically change. We got to Antarctica via a city called Punta Arenas at the tip of Chile on a plane that would land on a strip of blue ice. Conditions had to be absolutely perfect for the plane to land, so our flight going in was a little delayed, meaning that we'd have less time to actually climb the mountain. But once we actually got there, Antarctica absolutely blew my mind. Yes, it was cold. The thermometer dipped down to 40 below while we were there. But that sense of recognition of how tiny I was against this vast, empty continent, this massive part of the world that's so outside the realm of most people's daily lives, was a truly humbling and awesome experience. Now, my whole team had obviously already put a lot into this, so we wanted to make the most of it, meaning that we darn well wanted to make it to the summit. And while in some ways we had already been on harder peaks, it was cold and we were booking it decently fast. So come summit day, I was feeling pretty rotten. I was tired and kind of sick. For the first time, I seriously doubted whether I had it in me to make it to the summit. But I also recognized that this was our one big shot. So thinking about going all the way to the summit was too overwhelming. So instead, I'd pick a pile of rocks that I could see and just tell myself, okay, all I need to do is make it there. That's all. And then I'd tuck my head down until I was there. And then I tell myself, okay, all I need to do is take 200 steps. That's easy. And then I take my mind off my discomfort by counting them. After several hours, I realized that we were nearly there. And by the time we made it, I was so amazed and in disbelief of what I had just done. All I could do was put my head down on my ice axe and start to quietly cry. While there had been other peaks on which I wasn't sure that I'd make it because of factors beyond myself, this was really the first time where I seriously doubted whether I'd make it because I just didn't think I'd had the physical capabilities to do so. But this taught me the sixth lesson of the 7 summits, which is that when a task starts to feel too overwhelming, if you break it down into smaller pieces, you can still slowly but surely get there. So now all of this led to the big kahuna, Everest, the highest mountain in the world, the one for which I'd have to draw upon all of these lessons in order to get it done. Climbing Everest was a monolith of an undertaking that in some ways I'm probably still trying to understand. From base camp, we went across ladders and up seracs in the Khumbu Icefall, and then through the Western Khum, which led us to Camp 2. From Camp 2, we went up the Lhotse Face, which is this really steep wall of ice that just feels like it goes on forever. But it eventually got us to Camp 4. Now that sounds easy, but that was a rapidly sped up version of the process that actually took us about a month and a half. But by the time we were finally ready to leave Camp 4 for the summit, we took off at 10 p.m. the night before. I couldn't really see where the route led, so all I could do was trust that if I just kept putting one foot in front of the other, I would eventually get there. And slowly but surely, over the South Summit, the infamous Hillary Step, the Southeast Ridge, I made it to the moment that everyone hones in on to ask me about, the summit. And while this might have been the moment that got me into the Guinness Book for having been, at that time, the youngest person to have climbed the 7 summits, I can't say that it was actually the height of the adventure. In some ways, it was honestly a little confusing being up there. I felt like I was supposed to be having this big spiritual experience. But really, you're just sitting on top of a giant mound of snow and rocks. Which gets into the final lesson of the 7 summits. When you've had a goal that's been such a big part of shaping who you are, especially through your teenage years when you've got a lot wrapped up in finding your sense of identity, I think the side to achieving goals that gets less talked about is what happens when you don't have it anymore. But since then, and now that I've had a little more perspective on it through college, grad school, and launching a career as a journalist, I realized that reaching the goal wasn't why having climbed the 7 summits was such an amazing thing to do. It was an amazing thing because of the feeling that it gave me in the moment that this photograph was taken. This was after we had come back down from the summit and we're at base camp. And in this moment, I felt infinite. Not even so much because of what I had just done, but because of the sense that now I could do anything that I wanted to if I set my mind to it. I'm still a quiet, introverted person, but having learned on Kilimanjaro how to own my own voice, I can continue to value that voice. Sometimes I still get fixated on what might make me feel miserable, because we all know that life has plenty of misery to hand out. But having learned in Elbrus that sometimes it takes just a really easy fix to make a situation feel better, I now don't worry as much when the daily grind starts to feel rough. I'm still playing the constant game of trying to understand my own limits, how much is too much, or what's big and bold but still within my own grasp. But having explored those limits on Vinson, I now know that when I start to feel a little too deep in over my head, if I break it down into manageable pieces, I can still eventually get there. So the final lesson of the 7 summits is that reaching the goal isn't actually the entire point of or the end of the experience. The goal is just the motivation that gets you out there to learn about the world and about yourself, and more ready to take on whatever goal it is that comes next. All right, thank you.